Today we have Birthe Zåncker, who is at the MBA, and she works in the Cunliffe laboratory. And she works on various microbial ecology, and is going to introduce her research on polar bacteria and fungi. And then following on from that, we're going to hear from Jim McNeill from the Ice Warrior, who's an Arctic expedition and research scientist, who's going to be talking about not only his expeditions to the last pole and his planned expedition, but also his plans with a QAJAQ, which I'll leave a suspense for you to find out what a QAJAQ is. I hope I've pronounced that correct.
So yeah, as Maya said, I'm going to talk a bit about microbes in polar regions today. The focus of our work at the moment. And I mean, depending on your background, you might know fungi from the forests, where they are decomposing organic matter. But fungi are also quite abundant in the ocean and in the Arctic. And in these environments, they can also decompose organic matter, or they can also live as parasites, as you can see on these pictures. So these round structures here and here are the fungal cells, and this elongated cell here is a tiny algae. And the fungi can attack the algae and live off their cell contents. And in the second picture here, you can see some more fungi parasitizing a tiny algae. And you can see that the fungal cells have kind of burst to release their spores into the marine environment, so into the surrounding water, so that they can then in turn attack more algae. And it's not just fungi that we're looking at, but we're kind of looking at microbes as a whole. So that's all quite interconnected, this microbial loop, in the marine environment and in the Arctic in specific. And so basically, we can start here with the tiny single-celled algae. And they can, with the help of the energy of sunlight, they can take up CO2 and nutrients and grow and build a variety of compounds such as sugars and proteins. And occasionally they can release these into the water, and then other organisms such as fungi or bacteria can take up these nutrients and grow on them. But of course, not all the sugars and proteins are completely eaten up. So some of them, due to water movement, can aggregate and can form organic matter particles. And then we also have these zooplankton, so tiny animals, which can feed on the algae, but also on the bacteria and the fungi. And all these interactions then in turn can fuel the growth of larger organisms such as whales and seals and fish, and the seals and can be eaten by the polar bears. So all these characteristic animals that we know, they're really dependent on these tiny, tiny microbes. And not everything is eaten directly. So some of the organic matter particles and the zooplanktons are just as other animals as well. They produce feces, and these can sink to the bottom of the ocean and to the sediments. And along with these particles and feces that are sinking down, also the carbon that is stored in them is sinking down and is taken kind of out of the atmosphere and upper ocean into the deeper layers. So we have this intricate, all these relationships between the organisms that have established over long periods of time. But as we know, the Arctic is changing quite a bit at the moment. And this video is showing the sea ice extent in the Arctic from 1984 to 2019. And what we can see is, so in white, we have the older sea ice that has been around for 3 or 4 years. And these light blue areas, they stand for the younger sea ice, which has only been around for 1 year. So this type of ice forms in the autumn-winter period and then melts in the spring-summer period. And as we would expect, you can quite nicely see this change between the different seasons. So we have more ice extent in the cold winter and less ice extent in the warm summers. And what you can see is that over the years, gradually, we observe this change of less and less of this old ice that's depicted in white here, more and more towards younger sea ice. And what we can also see quite nicely from this map is that the exchange that the Arctic Ocean is having with the other oceans. So over here you can see that it's a relatively small connection between the Pacific and the Arctic, whereas on the other hand here we have quite a large connection between the Atlantic and the Arctic. And the movement of the ice is also quite nicely showing how some of the currents are flowing. So we have an outflow of water from the Arctic to the North Atlantic along the Greenland coast that is also transporting some of the ice into lower latitudes. And then on the other hand, we have, signified by this red arrow, we have the warm water masses coming from the Atlantic up north to the Arctic. And what might not be so obvious from this video is that in addition to this sea ice change that we are seeing, we also have more inflow of warm water from the lower latitudes to the north. And it's not just the water that's coming up further and further north, but with it, the water is also transporting new species to the Arctic. So, and this change is happening on different levels. So we observe different phytoplankton, so different algae coming further and further north, but also, for example, different fish species that turn up further and further north. And so what we would like to understand is how does this affect the microbes in the Arctic that are the base of the food web? And ultimately, when the microbes are changing, how does that affect the carbon export from the surface to the deeper layers? So as you can imagine, when we have less sea ice, that means that the light can directly, instead of being blocked by the sea ice, can directly enter the ocean. So more light is likely to be available in the future. So how will that affect the algae that use the sunlight? How will their growth affect the bacteria and fungi? There are different predictions, and they vary quite a bit. So we definitely need more information to look more into that. And the best way to make more predictions and to better understand this system is to go there and take samples and see how everything is working. So that's why we're going to the Arctic and also the Antarctic regions to understand how these polar regions are changing. For that, and there's usually a lot of preparations involved in the field work. So the cruises are around 1 to 2 months. And as you can imagine, it's quite remote areas. There are no shops around, so you really need to make sure that you take everything with you that you need. We usually end up with 1 or 2 of these pallets, which we then can transport to the ships. And here are the 2 ships where our polar research was based on. So up here in red, we have the James Clark Ross, which is the British research icebreaker that we use to take samples in the Arctic. And down here in blue, we have Polarstern, which is the German research icebreaker, which took us to take samples in the Antarctic. And the way we're conducting our research is if we want to look at the microbes in the water, of course, first we need to bring the water on board the ship. So for that, we're using these CTD rosettes, as they're called, and you can see that there are 24 bottles assembled around in a circle, and they're let down into the water where they can be closed, and then they transport the water up on board the ship. And then inside the ship, there are lots of different laboratories, and we can treat our water there. So for us, that mainly means filtering water. And then, so here you can see 2 different filtration devices that we have. And in the bottom here, we are collecting the water afterwards. And so going a bit more detail into what we're actually doing. So in the water, you have all these different organisms. So you have the algae, the fungi, and the bacteria. And then when we're filtering them, we're kind of taking all these organisms in the water and concentrating them on the filter. And then these filters get frozen and transported back to our home laboratory, where we can then treat them further. And what we do is we kind of take the cells of the filters, we break the cells open to be able to get to their cell contents. And then we extract their genomic information, so their DNA. And once we have this DNA, we can send it off for sequencing. And basically what the sequencing centers do is they more or less read the DNA sequence, and what we get back is this long string of letters, which are signifying the different base pairs of the DNA. And with these sequences, we can then look at different databases, and we can see, okay, the first sequence that we have is a phytoplankton, and we can't just, it doesn't only allow us to say that it's a phytoplankton, but also which type of phytoplankton it is. And the same goes for the fungi and bacteria, so that we get really a nice overview of which microbes are present in the different waters. And of course, when you're on board, you're working a lot, but especially if you're on board for 2 months, there's also some free time. And usually when you sample the Antarctic, because you can't, because their summers are our winters, and you can only sample the polar regions in the local summer periods, because otherwise the ice is just too strong even for the research icebreakers to go through. So that means that a lot of times the Antarctic cruises are leaving around middle of December, which then means that you spend New Year's Eve or Christmas and New Year's Eve on board. And these pictures, so on the top left, you can see that this is the heli hangar, where usually the 2 helicopters were standing, but they've been taken outside so that we could prepare a nice party and decorate with some balloons. And on the walls are hanging all the flags of the participants from the crew and scientists and their countries of origin. And in the bottom here, we can see how we all assembled at midnight on the bridge to welcome the new year. And then as another tradition on New Year's Eve, so every day at midnight, all throughout the cruise, a weather balloon is released from the ship to the atmosphere to measure the atmosphere. And on New Year's Eve, people can write their greetings on the balloon, and also attach tiny pieces of paper with their New Year's wishes to the balloon. And each ship really has its own little traditions that you get to know when you're staying on board. So for example, on Polarstern, when it's somebody's birthday, it's usually the scientists who are baking a cake. So you get access to the large kitchen of theirs, which is quite a nice change. And a tradition which I think pretty much every research ship has is to decorate these styrofoam cups. And then these styrofoam cups are attached to the CTD, to the water sampling system, and they are let down to several thousand meters of water depth. And then with the water pressure, these styrofoam cups become quite compressed. So here you can see a before and after picture, and you can see that you really notice the change that the water pressure has on this styrofoam cup. And Polarstern is also the supply vessel for the German Antarctic Research Station, which is called Neumeier, and which is located on the shelf ice close to the meridian. And on the left, you can see the station, and on the right, you can see kind of the view from the ship onto the shelf ice. And here in the middle, in the background, very tiny, you can see the station. And these red flags over to the bottom left and to the bottom right, they kind of tell everybody where the no-go zone is. So you cannot just, there are a lot of cracks in the shelf ice, so you can't just go directly to the edge, because some of the ice might fall down, and yeah, you don't want to stand on top of that. So the way we're getting from the ship to the ice and back is with this like little red box that you can see here. So 3 to 4 people can fit in there and then can be transported back and forth safely from the ship onto the ice. And this is a view from the research station itself. And while several people can eat and work and sleep inside the research station itself, during the summer months, a lot of people are visiting to conduct their research and experiments. And so they have some additional pods for sleeping here, and everything is connected with these kind of guiding lines, because when the weather turns a bit, it's quite easy to lose orientation. So with these lines, you can always find your way. And on the top left, we have this white container over here. Oops, sorry. And that is the greenhouse of Neumeier. So they can grow plants from seeds and nutrient solutions, so soil would be too heavy to transport all that way. So this is kind of that they, in the winter, they can have fresh vegetables, fresh herbs, but it's also a pilot project to see if plants can grow quite nicely like this, and if this can be used, for example, for space missions in the future. And on the top right over here, the green container, that is their library. And that's supposedly the southernmost library. But we didn't just meet people, we also met a lot of wildlife on the sea ice. So in the Antarctic, we were greeted by quite a lot of penguins. So on the bottom here, you have Adelie penguins, on the top, emperor penguin chicks. And in the Arctic, the polar bears were quite curious to see what we were doing on the ship and came to check us out a couple of times. And while you have all these animal and wildlife on the ice, and in a lot of places the ice looks quite pristine, you also, especially when the ship is going through the ice, all that water movement and breaking of the ice kind of turns some of the ice upside down. And then you can see that in some regions, it really looks quite brown. And this is not some dirt or sediment or so, but these are actually algae growing on the underside of the ice. And so in some regions, the water under the ice is really teeming with life. And you have the same components as we saw earlier. So you have these algae, which can be parasitized by fungal cells. And you have this organic matter, which is clumped together and can be eaten by bacteria or fungi. So really a lot of life that you might not suspect. And what you can also see is that the ice isn't like a solid, smooth surface, but it actually has a lot of little valleys and hills, which can be quite nice places for microbes to attach. And in addition, the ice is not a solid, it's not solid. So you have all these little water channels and pockets of water in the ice itself, especially as you move down in the ice. And this water that is inside the ice, it's quite salty, but still organisms can live in it. So not just under the ice that you have a lot of life, but also inside the ice that you can find a lot of life happening there. And so while we were taking these water samples in the Antarctic and the Arctic, we were becoming more and more interested in the sea ice. But as you can imagine, sampling the sea ice is quite different from sampling the water. So in order to learn how to sample the sea ice, there was a field course in Oulu in northern Finland in March 2 years ago now. And here in the background, you can see the frozen sea. And this is the right picture is kind of a picture of how the sea ice looked. And yeah, we even got lucky and saw some northern lights during the nights. And basically we got introduced to all these different methods of how to sample the ice and the snow, because when you're looking at the ice, you really also want to have a look at the snow that's covering it, because ultimately the snow is determining how much light is reaching the ice and how much light is available for the algae that grow inside the ice. So here on the red sledge, you can see in the sledge there are some instruments which are measuring the snow thickness, and they can be pulled quite over long distances to give a nice overview of the snow thickness. With these small ice cores here, you can drill tiny holes and measure the ice thickness. And then we have these larger cores which can pull out entire ice sections. And then, as you can see on the very right picture, you can saw them in half, or not just in half, but in little pieces. And then these can be thawed later on and again filtered. And then we can have a look at the microbes that are present in the ice itself. So using this knowledge, we are preparing at the moment for a cruise in this summer to the Central Arctic Ocean, where we want to sample all the microbes in the water and also in the ice. And we'll also have a look at certain mineral particles which are forming under specific conditions in the ice, and how microbes and organic matter are attaching to these minerals, and then how that is affecting the drawdown of carbon from the upper ocean to the deeper ocean layers. And with that, I would like to thank everybody who made this work possible, and thank you for your attention.
Brilliant, thank you, Birthe. So moving on from that, so as Birthe said, she had to do some training in Finland to be able to do the ice core sampling. And one of the things with traveling to any sort of Arctic region is that there is a certain element of risk. But fortunately, we have people like Jim. So Jim, if you want to turn your camera and microphone on for me. So Jim, you're actually a safety consultant as well as a polar explorer, and you've acted as a sort of advisor for things like Frozen Planet during your time. So what sort of things do you advise there, or is that part of your talk?
Don't go. It's far
it
too
looks
cold.
too beautiful
Don't go.
not to go. I think we all want to go after Birthe's talk.
No, yeah, I get involved with creating all the safety guidance, but rather than a normal health and safety executive, I produce something that's at the very most 10 pages thick, so you can actually absorb it and you actually end up going home safely, hopefully. I've never lost anyone yet, anyway.
Great stuff. Well, it's lovely to have you here, Jim, and it's great to hear a slightly different story, but still connected, because you were a former scientist and you do sort of citizen science projects on your expeditions as well, and now set up Ice Warrior. And Ice Warrior has a shop front in Princetown on Dartmoor, close to us here in Plymouth and Devon, and we're really looking to hear more about your last pole upcoming expedition, Jim. So I shall ask you to share your screen, please, and then I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for having me. And I'm not used to talking to machines. I usually have an audience, so please excuse me. I'm always talking, well, I am talking to myself, actually, which is, interesting. Anyway, Ice Warrior, I invented 20 years ago today, not today, but in January. And it really is an emulation of the golden era of exploration, where there were no experts. And people called for volunteers from all walks of life, all echelons of society, to go on these extraordinary expeditions with the likes of Scott and Shackleton and all those sorts of people. In those days, they didn't even know where they were going half the time, and they certainly didn't know when they were coming back most of the time. And so it's very interesting. I have been doing polar stuff for 36 years, and I always point out that I've still got my fingers and toes. You can't see my toes, but they are there. And that's probably more by luck than judgment, to be perfectly honest. Yeah, so in 20 years, we've conducted 7 major expeditions and huge citizen sort of science projects, really, for the scientific community. I started life, as Maya said, as a scientist myself, working on the depletion of the ozone layer in the early 80s as a result of agricultural practices. Actually, I was a soil scientist looking at gaseous emissions and phytofertilizer, nitrogen and things like that. So I have a little bit of a foot in the door of a scientific community, and I think that's given us a massive advantage as an organization, because I can sort of talk the lingo still, sometimes maybe. But it does mean that our scientific partners that we have for Ice Warrior are some of the best in the world. So we've got the National Snow and Ice Data Center in Colorado, who really are the people who say what's happening with the ice north and south, as well as NASA and RE, the Russian organization, the Norwegian Polar Institute, and all sorts of other institutes as well. And in this country, with Cambridge University, Scott Polar Research Institute, University College London, and all sorts of other people we get involved with, which is fantastic. We do have other supporters, more renowned supporters, I suppose. So Ranulph Fiennes, I've been trying to keep him alive for the last 20 years. I think he's finally given up the ghost, but he won't admit that. Michael Palin, who very kindly supports us. Alexandra Shackleton. She is the granddaughter of Sir Ernest Shackleton. The reason she's on board really is because of the next expedition, which I'll go into later. And Sir Chris Bonington, and a whole host of other people. That's the sort of BS factor, if you like, for want of a better phrase. But it does give us a sort of public position. We have two bases. I have two bases, one in Svalbard, way up here, which you can see in Longyearbyen, or just outside Longyearbyen, actually. And here we operate expeditions from, and we train people. So these people come to us from all walks of life, as I said, all echelons of society. And they are, by and large, complete and utter novices. You don't have to have been camping, you don't have to be an outdoors person, but here on Dartmoor, which is where our HQ is situated, we change them into outdoors people. And then we send them up to Svalbard at the moment and do all the stuff that we did on Dartmoor in the very cold regions. And they start putting on their gloves and getting used to their systems and what have you. What we don't have, I suppose, which is a difference, is a nice warm boat to go back to. So it is a much more of a mindset than if you did have a boat to go back to, or a warm environment, I suppose. And that's where people fall off. That's where we lose people. It's very difficult dealing with Mother Nature at her worst, potentially, or certainly near her worst, you know, at minus 40, minus 45, and living out in it. It's quite relentless, and it really can get to you mentally more than physically. I've had the most physically fit people you know, join us, but very often they can't take the mental side of things, which is quite interesting. The other base I have is down here in Resolute Bay, but it's extremely expensive to get to Resolute at the moment, so we don't use it as a training base, although I do use it for the TV productions that Maya alluded to. So a lot of Frozen Planet, Human Planet, and the Natural World series I've operated out of here when we're following wolves and things like that. So very lucky indeed. It's fair to say, and I like to say this, that I'm not a silver-spooned explorer. I'm just an ordinary guy myself. So I am the exemplar, if you like, for our participants. If I can do it, almost anyone can do it. And in all the people that I've trained, which is over 400 people, now, I think there are only probably 7 that I've had to say, I don't think this is for you. And it's normally something to do with up here. We do get out there and we do get cold, and we do carry scientific instrumentation with us. But before all that, we get into the training. So we do train for every eventuality. If I have an asset in life, it is a vivid imagination. And so I invent all these nasty, nasty situations that might arise when we're out on the sea ice or when we're out in the Arctic or Antarctic regions. And we do go through how to cope with those in every which way, shape or form. The kind of citizen science we get involved with is quite extensive and quite varied, actually. So anything from, if you look at the bottom left-hand corner here, this is 13 weeks of physiology that we did for John Moores University up in Liverpool, measuring what happens to the body under this sort of duress and living out there. So we were thermisted up all over our bodies, and they measured everything. And not only that, but it was in combination with a mental examination of what happens to the brain under that sort of duress as well. The kind of, this is actually on Frozen Planet, but we do actually do citizen science during those periods as well, you know, noting particularly populations and behaviors and things like that with animals. This was an industrial piece of work, really, working on a skin product that would protect us from the terrible sun that you get up there. Everything reflects off the snows and the sea ice, as you probably know. So you end up looking like not an orangutan, but a raccoon. Sorry, that's the word. And we also test equipment and things like that for other industrial people. But the real sort of citizen science, I mean, we did quite a bit of work with Professor Tom Grenfell of the Washington University on particulate matter falling onto snow, soot in snow observation, as he calls it, and that was great. Obviously, that affects the albedo or the reflectance of the snow, and that's crucially important in terms of, you know, measuring pollutants in what should be a pristine environment. We do dig holes in the snow because obviously the satellite imagery is fooled by the amount of snow on top of ice, and so we measure the amount of snow on top of the ice and we measure the ice underneath, and sometimes that can be 3.5 meters thick, but more often than not these days we have lost huge amounts of multi-year ice, and they've actually downgraded the definition of multi-year ice from 7 years to 4 years, I believe. And that gives us an indication of, you know, what's left. We ground truth, if you like, for the satellites in that respect. Data loggers of various things. Sometimes the scientific operations are quite large. Here, this was a very big Spanish scientific thing that I organized and orchestrated and did all the logistics for. Occasionally, we get involved in history. There is the BBC Terror programme on, which I don't actually like very much personally, but it does convey what happened to Franklin's ships in the 1850s, and on an expedition that I was doing just outside of Resolute, in fact 21 miles outside along the coast, there is a bay called HMS Assistance Bay, and in there we found this cache of food, and there wasn't any food left, of course, but there were bits and pieces, and this documentation for that, which was quite exciting. Yeah, we test equipment. We also count polar bears. Everything we do also, we work with the Met Office in this country and also the Met Office in Canada, the Environment Canada, a lot to measure weather. We still have a lack of understanding, unfortunately, about how that weather system operates and its effect globally on the rest of weather systems. Over the 36 years I've been doing it, the weather changes have been extraordinary, it's fair to say. You used to be able to predict what was going to happen at a certain point in time, whether you were going out there in just towards the end of the polar night, and then, you know, following on from that, you used to be able to predict that sort of weather pattern. These days you just can't. And in fact, a great example of that was when we were filming for Frozen Planet, and in the 12-week shoot that we did on Ellesmere Island, right at the top of Canada, We ran out of sun cream. It went up to +30, and it went down to -22 with huge snow drifts and difficulty getting about all over the place. So these days, from a planning perspective, from a safety perspective, you have to prepare for all eventualities, which is quite difficult. Polar bears, I love polar bears, and obviously we're confronted with polar bears. We don't have a ship to get behind, so we are very careful at knowing what behavior a bear is exhibiting and being complementary to that behavior and trying to persuade them that we're not their next meal. I've come across hundreds and sat with hundreds as they're being filmed, and they never cease to amaze me. You get this overwhelming feeling that you are in their territory and they'll do exactly what they want to do, but the trick is to persuade them to go away, unless you're filming them, of course. But they are magnificent animals. We have an ongoing counting of polar bears for the Norwegian Polar Institute, where we say where we've come across them, what behavior they're exhibiting, whether they're male, female, what sort of size they are, what distinctive marks they've got. I call it polar bear twitching because it's probably the same as bird twitching in your garden, but it's a fantastic thing to do. Ooh. This is the kind of publicity side of things as well. I'll just play this very quickly. Oh, no, wait.
Jim, we're not quite getting any sound on that. Is there supposed to be sound on it?
Are you? Right, okay.
No.
I'll tell you what, I'll leave it. How's that? So as I say, the partners that we've got are all sorts of partners. We have our own scientist, principal scientist, who is a volunteer, it's fair to say, and that's Bjorn Erlingsson, who is a very well written up sea ice mechanic, I call him. He's into the physics of sea ice, and we have a great lack of understanding about that, but I'll come into that later. But we do try and put these portfolios of science together. We never pretend to be scientists, it's fair to say, but we do data gather under the orchestration and direction of real scientists, and we follow their methodologies and systems in order to gather that data. And then we give it over to them free of charge. So it's lovely when we get new partners, and we're hoping to partner up with the MBA to sort out some science for the Arctic on our next expedition, which is called Last Pole. Now, these are very big statements, very big, bold and marketing type statements, but I will actually stand by every one of them. So there is a place on the Arctic Ocean called the Northern Pole of Inaccessibility, which has not been reached by humankind yet. Particularly over the surface, but it actually hasn't been reached at all because we repositioned it. I asked the Scott Polar Research Institute, in conjunction with scientists from the National Snow and Ice Status Centre, to find out where the furthest point from land on the Arctic Ocean was, which is the definition of the Northern Pole of Inaccessibility, and see if it's the same as was predicted in 1927, when the first guy who wanted to know where that was, a guy called Sir Hubert Wilkins, positioned it. And he positioned it there because he wanted to fly over the Arctic Ocean from one side to the next, to be the first person to do that. I am not, it's fair to say, motivated by any of these sort of flag waving, flag posting, conquering type things. I am motivated by the purpose and worthwhile nature of what we do. So this is probably the biggest by virtue of the number of people involved. There are 28 citizen scientists in 4 teams of 7 who will each push a route, and I'll show you the route in a minute. Well, here's the route. It's an 800-mile route from the edge of the Canadian landfall to this center of the Arctic Ocean, which is also known as the Arctic Pole. So I'll split these people into teams of 7 and myself, and we will be doing as much science en route as we possibly can without it interfering with our sort of safety. and one team will take over from another team, which will take over from another team. It looks all perfectly sort of systematic there, but the truth is team one will probably only get a tiny bit out sort of in this region. Team two will then stretch out, and then, you know, by the time we get up here, we'll possibly be swimming it. So one of the problems getting over the sea ice these days is the breakup and the degree of open water that you come across, which is why in 2006, which is the last time I tried to get to this pole, I fell in through the sea ice, eventually 170 nautical miles north of the last landfall of Canada. And I thought there must be an easier way of crossing these bits of open water. Now, at the time, I was a fireman, but I was I had a global presence in terms of rescuing people in extreme environments. And so I thought, wouldn't it be fantastic? Just a very simple idea to get a canoe, basically, and put runners on it and enclose it a little bit, so that you've got, on the one hand, a much more effective and efficient way of crossing a lead of open water, an area of open water, so you can just dunk it in essence, and paddle it. And on the other hand, you can pull it out, haul it haul it across sea ice, very difficult sea ice terrain, at the same time. And also, it would act as a survival pod if the proverbial what's it hits the fan. So that's what the QAJAQ is. QAJAQ is the Inuktitut word for kayak, and it's in various iterations at the moment. It looks a little less than sexy at the moment, but we're hoping to work with the Marine Business Technology Centre to develop and configure it in those two roles, really. One as a sort of adventurous sledge, and secondly as a survival pod for anyone working on that sort of particular terrain. So it can be pulled along by snowmobile or whatever, and configured so that you can get into it, you can live in it essentially, and paddle it on open water if necessary. The future of Ice Warrior, it's always been a model for other extreme environments, it's fair to say, and one in particular you'd be interested in is the Ocean Warrior strand, but we will go into the mountains. We've got a desert one all sorted out, and the jungle will come on later. So interesting things, but it's all about citizens getting out there, training. So it's the development of those citizens, it's the discovery of change within the world we live in, and it's the delivery of that in stories which will engage others about you know, the changing nature of the world we live in. If you can imagine those in their particular environments, I'm not short of ambition. So if I achieve my aims, which I'm not sure I will, but you've got to go for it, then I will have something called an Earth Station, where it's a sort of an experiential museum stroke forum, where we're really putting a pulse, or catching the pulse of the planet in its extreme environments, and beaming it into one central place where we can be perhaps a little bit more informed about you know, the future of politics and our commercial ways, and good and bad. So if I get my way, the Earth Station will say all that and educate people at the same time. We are starting to get it to grips with people in Plymouth, the MBA being one of them, which is fantastic, because we are headquartered here and we started here 20 years ago, as I said. So that's a really great thing. Anyone and everyone can be involved, even if they just tell other people about it, and that's what we're all about, really. The more people that are engaged in just a tiny little way, even send us little messages that make a massive difference, I have to tell you, when you're on sea ice pushing your limits, then the better the whole thing becomes, and the more science we can do, and the more people are engaged, and the better off, the more worthwhile nature of the whole project. I hope that gives you a tiny little idea of what we're about. Happy to answer any questions whatsoever, but in the meantime, thank you very much for paying attention. I think you have anyway. I'm still talking to a machine, which I can't get used to.